All right, today we're going to break down a really detailed critique of Sadhguru. We're going to walk through a source that dissects his teachings step by step, looking at its core arguments, from what it calls factual errors all the way to the logical fallacies it claims to find. Okay, let's dive right in. So, the source material we're looking at frames this entire thing as a clash between two totally opposing worldviews. On one side, you've got self-salvation, the idea that you find spiritual truth through your own effort and looking inward. And on the other side, there's divine revelation, where truth is handed down from a divine source. The source argues that Sadhguru's philosophy falls squarely in that self-salvation camp, and it uses this basic contrast as the launchpad for its entire critique. So how does the source even begin to build its case? Well, it adopts a very specific lens, one it actually pulls from a biblical passage. It calls this whole framework knowledge falsely so-called. And get this one verse becomes the main tool for its entire analysis. It's basically using this passage to categorize teachings it sees as vain babblings and contradictions. In short, it's a form of knowledge that, according to the source, isn't based on anything you can actually verify. Okay, so the first concept that gets put under this critical microscope is jnana yoga. It's known as the path of knowledge, right? It's a method for reaching enlightenment through your own intellectual searching. And because this path depends so heavily on a specific kind of self-generated knowledge, the source flags it as the central practice it really wants to deconstruct. So, how does the source claim this false knowledge is actually constructed? It points to a really key rhetorical technique, equivocation. This is where a word is used with multiple meanings, often in the same breath. The critique argues that you'll see scientific terms like quantum physics or energy used almost interchangeably with spiritual concepts, which it claims creates this misleading appearance of scientific legitimacy. All right, let's get into the first big category of the critique, which the source labels factual errors. This section is all about claims that it argues just aren't backed up by any empirical or scientific evidence. And here's where we really see the heart of that argument. The source claims that these central concepts are presented as if they're scientific realities. Take chakras, for example. The source points out that they're described as physical energy centers, but, there's no anatomical or biological evidence for them. Or prana. It's discussed like it's this tangible life force, but it's not something you can measure in physics or chemistry. The critique's whole position here is that while these are important ideas in Hindu scripture, they're being presented as verifiable facts without the science to back them up. From there, the analysis really shifts gears. It moves on from questioning the factual basis of the claims and starts to look at the logical structure of the arguments themselves. This is where the source begins to identify what it sees as fundamental logical fallacies. One thing that keeps popping up here is the non sequitur. You've probably heard of it. It's when a conclusion just plain doesn't follow from the evidence given. The source argues that many of the arguments are structured exactly this way. For example, it claims that using something like quantum mechanics to explain human consciousness is a classic non sequitur, because a discovery in one field doesn't automatically prove a conclusion in a completely different one. And this slide really breaks down the specific fallacies the source claims to find. It points to a few key tactics. There's false equivalence, which is treating a scientific term and a spiritual idea as if they're the same thing. Then there's the appeal to mystery, where a lack of a scientific explanation is kind of used as proof of a spiritual one. And of course, the red herring, which is when difficult questions are supposedly sidestepped by diving into these big, abstract philosophical discussions. So, this brings up a huge question, right? If the critique argues that these teachings are built on factual and logical errors, then it has to answer, why are they so popular? The source's final section tries to do just that. The source asks this question point blank, and it's a really critical turn in the analysis because it moves from just deconstructing the ideas to trying to explain why they're so compelling to so many people, even with these criticisms. So what's the answer? Well, according to this source, it all comes down to cognitive biases. Those mental shortcuts our brains use all the time. It argues that authority bias makes people more likely to just accept what a charismatic figure says. Confirmation bias means we tend to favor ideas that already fit what we believe. And then there's the good old bandwagon effect, which suggests that sometimes popularity itself can be mistaken for truth. And that brings us to the end, where the source leaves us with this one last really provocative question. It suggests this whole debate boils down to something fundamental.
What tools do we actually use to tell the difference between what it calls persuasive speculation and verifiable truth? It's a question that honestly goes way beyond any single teacher or philosophy, and it really asks all of us to think critically about how we form our own beliefs.